Like I was saying, I do enjoy the different series that he has, but the Lord laid on my heart tonight a message about Joseph, and I certainly like character studies as much as I like studies through the book of Galatians, for instance. I believe that when we look at the Bible, when we study, when we preach and read the Bible, we should do it verse by verse. We should see what does the Bible say as it says it, and I appreciate that. And I also like looking at character studies. Because just like the different individuals in the Bible, the different people that we look at in the Bible, we can relate to them. Because we know that as we look at a person, we can think, hey, this is a real person who really lived. And God has given us their story and taught us from their life. And as we look at Joseph tonight, I just want to look at really one thought around his life. And one of the reasons that Joseph is such a popular character, such a popular person in the Bible is because it's generally believed that there is nothing that is said negatively about Joseph in his life as far as his character is concerned. Now, some would say that when he spoke about the dreams that God had given to him, that he spoke disrespectfully or he spoke out of turn, but we, knowing the Bible and knowing what it says about those dreams, we know that that was divine communication. That was God giving a revelation of, hey, here's what's going to happen. It was something that was at the time unknown or otherwise unknowable, and that was God speaking to Joseph through this dream as he spoke to man differently in those days. Obviously, they didn't have a written word, and but generally it's believed that Joseph, there's no wrong about him, and I would agree with that. But Joseph is different from almost everybody in the Bible because of that reason. Of course, we wouldn't say that about Jesus, who was the Son of God, but most everyone we find in the Bible, there's always some other stipulation to their name that we could focus on. Yet we see them as somebody who God worked through and worked in their life, not in that order. We know that God works in us in order that he might work through us. That's what it means to be used of God, when I submit myself to the work that he's going to do in my heart, and he works through my life in turn. But the thing about Joseph's life is, while we know that Moses, before he was a great leader, Moses was a murderer. And we know that before Peter was the great preacher, we know that Peter was the one who denied Christ. And we know that while Joseph was the great king, the great man after God's own heart, he was also someone who was an adulterer, as well as a murderer. But Joseph, he stands out as someone who had what the Bible would call simply a good name. And we know that Proverbs 22 and verse 1 says that one of the most valuable things that each and every one of you and I in this room has is, in fact, our name. It's our reputation. It's what our life says about us. It's what our name means as it represents who we are. A good way to think about what my reputation is, who I am in the light of others, is when my name rings in someone else's ear, what is it that they think about my life? And moreover, not only what do other men think about me, because we know that men look at our reputation, but when my name, my person comes before God, what does he say about me? Because while men look at our reputation, we know that God looks at our character, because men truly do only see the outward. That's just a fact that's laid out in the Bible, but God does look on the heart. And I don't know about you, but to me, this year, it's gone by incredibly fast. When I first realized that Easter was right around the corner, and moreover that it was in April, I was kind of shocked. I was taken back because I was like, man, it was just January. It seems like a few weeks ago. And often we know that at the beginning of the year, there's a great emphasis placed on what? We say, I'm going to do what? Make a New Year's, someone tell me. So New Year's resolution, that's right. We all say, hey, this year I am going to resolve to do something different. And what does that mean? It means simply that, hey, in the past year, I'm self-aware enough to know that, hey, this is what went wrong, and this is what went right. And because this didn't go wrong, because I made this decision, this poor decision, it had this poor outcome, well, I'm resolved to make a better change in the new year. And oftentimes people, they post on social media or Facebook or whatever, and they say what? They say, you know what, new year, new me. And they say, you know what, this year I'm going to have a clean slate. I'm going to go forward and I'm going to rebuild my reputation. I'm going to take my actions and I'm going to focus them. I'm going to change this part of my life or this thing, and I'm going to do better because of it. And essentially what that shows us is that there's an undeniable connection between who I am and what I do. We know that in the Bible, in 1 John 3:18, John says, "My little children," he said, "let us not love in tongue, neither in word," but how? But in deed and in truth. And John there was affirming the fact that, what we say doesn't matter quite as much as what we do. Because what we do defines us, but what we say, it doesn't matter if it's not backed up by an action. And there's an interesting verse that I would say kind of runs parallel to that first proverb I read to you guys, Proverbs 22:1, and that verse is in Ecclesiastes rather. And the verse says this, in Ecclesiastes 7:1, it sounds kind of morbid, but it says this, it says, "A good name is better than precious ointment." So there's the fact, a good name is better than this equally good thing. But then it follows that statement with saying, "and the day of one's death than the day of one's birth." So essentially it's saying, hey, a good name it's better than this precious substance. And likewise, the day of one's death, the day this man dies, is greater than the day he was born. Now, oftentimes we celebrate that differently. We celebrate when a baby's born, and we don't really celebrate when someone dies, is because they're not with us as much. And we know that for the saved individual, of course, they're in heaven. But what is it saying there? It's proving a point. And the point is this, is that from when a baby is born, he has essentially a clean slate. And when a man dies from the day he was born, from the day he was born until his actual death, he has spent his life doing what? Essentially, he has spent his life making decisions and making actions and acting on his beliefs and living according to his consequences. And what it's saying is, hey, remember that a good name is a very valuable thing. And when a man comes to the end of his life and he's retained his good name, he's made good decisions throughout his life, that in turn is a very valuable thing. I was telling Jesse and Brother Dave McLean right before the service, I said I thought that this Monday was Martin Luther King Day, which of course it was not Martin Luther King Day. That was on January the 15th of this year. But for some reason online, I kept seeing all these Martin Luther King quotes and different people were posting, and I think it was just kind of a matter of circumstance, unless there's some Martin Luther King situation that I just don't know happened. Was there something? I'll ask you guys. There wasn't? He died 50 years. Okay, so that was it. Well, I had a quote from Martin Luther King, and I was just like, man, I don't know if this is just working out or what, or if it's God saying, hey, put this quote in your message. But one of the most famous quotes by Martin Luther King is this: when he had his "I Have a Dream" speech on August the 28th, 1963. He had this famous line amongst all the other lines in the speech, which he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character." And I think tonight that we can look at Dr. King's life, and being 50 years since he was assassinated, he was someone who exemplified great character. And because of that, he was a great leader for civil rights for men and women throughout America. And likewise to Dr. King was this man that we're looking at in our Bibles, who was Joseph, a man who exemplified great character. I was talking to someone just the other day, a family member, and they're like, you keep using this word character. What exactly does that mean? And I think it would do the message injustice if we didn't define character. Character essentially is what we would call integrity. It's more than morality, but it's being genuine. The word integrity is from the word integer. Integer in math, it means one. It means the person through and through it's one. What you see on the outside is what you also have on the inside. And I think that's a pretty good definition of character. My character is who I am lived out before others. It's not what I say versus what I do. It's not me being two different people, but it's me being whole all the way through. And the lesson I think we're gonna see tonight from Joseph's life is that essentially the content of our character is determined by the content of our decisions, the content of our life. And if our name is directly attached to our decisions, we will find that the reputation that we have before men and the character that we have before God will be an outcome of the decisions that we make in our life. But if we'll look at our Bible, of course, we're going to look at the text, which is Genesis chapter number 37. If you'll turn there to Genesis 37, and I'll read a few verses at the latter end of the passage. Genesis 37 and verse 23, the Bible says this. It says, "And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat, and his coat of many colors that was upon him. And it says they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it." Essentially, it was a dried up well. And it goes on to say, "And they sat down to eat bread, and they lift up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down into Egypt. And Judah rather, said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him unto the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. And there passed by Midianites merchantmen." And to clear up the confusion, there is a lot between who really bought and sold Joseph. It would seem as you read, it says, "There passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt." And we know from the Bible that used to confuse me so much, and maybe I'm hitting on this where I shouldn't, but essentially what it's saying is, it's not saying the Midianites found Joseph and they sold him to the Ishmaelites. We know that in Genesis chapter 45, which is where we'll be on Sunday mornings very soon, that when Joseph finally confronts his brothers in Egypt, when he says, "Hey, it's actually me. Haha, I got you." He says, "This is who I am. I'm this second in command. I'm the vice president, if you will, of Egypt." He says in Genesis 45 and verse 4, it says, "It was you who sold me unto the Ishmaelites." And we know that from the Bible, the Ishmaelites, they come obviously from Ishmael, who was the first son of Abraham, the son that essentially never should have been born. He was the first son not of promise. And we know that Isaac was the first son of promise, because God had promised that Abraham was going to have a son through who? God promised Abraham that he'd have a son through Sarah. But what happened? They got ahead of God's plan, and in turn, Sarah gave Abraham his handmaid, and they had this son Ishmael. And Ishmael in Genesis chapter number 16, we know is the father of what would become known as the Ishmaelites. And then later on in Genesis chapter 25, we know that Abraham begins to have other sons with his concubines, and that was never a part of God's plan either. But he has a son whose name is Midian, and the Midian became known of the leader of the tribe of the Midianites. And the Midianites are found all throughout the land of Israel. They're found all the way going down into Canaan, going down into Egypt. We find them at Mount Sinai, and they go all the way into the Trans-Jordan Desert. So what we know is biblically, who are the Midianites? The Midianites would be this kind of confederation of nomadic people. So these terms are used interchangeably here, but what's the application? The application is we know that, hey, this, like Joseph's life, is very much a picture of Christ. Why? Because Ishmael, he was the first son. He was a picture of the disobedience of man. And just like Ishmael, we know that we are depraved. We are disobedient as men towards God. But then what came along? God's going to fulfill his promises despite the disobedience of mankind. So God provides Isaac through Abraham, and likewise, as God has provided Isaac through Abraham, God fulfilled his promise. God, who is rich in mercy for his great love wherewith he loved us, he did what? He sent a son, the firstborn according to the promise. So we see there's a picture here. But we know, going back to the text, that there was these Ishmaelites who bought Joseph from his brothers for what? For 20 pieces of silver. We know that was not that much to buy. It was the price of a common slave before it would be that they were sold. And then in verse 29, look where the Bible says, it says, "And Reuben returned unto the pit. And behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes." And it says he returned unto his brethren and said, "The child is not, whither shall I go?" And they took Joseph's coat, and they killed a kid of goats, and they dipped the coat in blood, and they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no." So essentially they are deceiving their father at this point. And he knew it, and he said, "It is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him." Joseph is without rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes, and he put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his sons many days. And in verse 35, and it says, "And all his sons rose up, and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I will go down into my grave unto my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. But look at verse 36. This is what I really want to focus on, where this story leads us. And it says, "And the Midianites, they sold him," being Joseph, into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and the captain of the guard. And you see, the thing that I really want to focus on just from this one verse, and we're going to look at a few other things before we really close all of this, is the fact that I was talking to a friend of mine recently. I know a few of you. How many of you guys had interest in that Israel trip that Pastor Cox had mentioned? You guys had a meeting about it recently. Well, it's Pastor Kurt Skelly. He's a friend of mine, and his son was my roommate for 2 years in college, and I was in his wedding 2 weekends ago. And he was telling me about a trip that they had done to Israel, and they had gone on what they call the Jesus Walk. And the Jesus Walk essentially is a 30-mile walk from one point where they spend the days walking, and I don't know if they camp or if they stay in a hotel or what, but they walk all the way to the Sea of Galilee. And he told me how on this Jesus Walk, he said just about everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. Because what happened essentially is they had this Jesus Walk during the rainy season, and the ground that they were walking on was completely unpaved. And so they were walking through mud the entire time. And he said that one of the people who was on the trip, she was walking in deep mud, and her boot completely got like sucked down into the mud. And she pulls it up, and it's just her foot, and she's like, I don't know where my boot's at. And they couldn't find it, and it was stuck in the mud, and that they could not get it out. And he said that it was one of the worst times that he had over there, but it was definitely an adventure. But he said what was interesting about the trip, which he was kind of being gracious because he knew that so many things had gone wrong. But he said it was very interesting to find who the complainers were on the trip. It was very interesting to find who reacted in their flesh as opposed to just kind of said, you know what, I'm not going to let this bother me. And what they did essentially is they walked in the rain part of the way, 30 miles up to the Sea of Galilee. But let's zoom out on the map and picture for a second where Joseph was at. Joseph had just been sold as if he were a piece of property. Joseph, a human, had been sold by his own brothers to these men, knowing full well that he would be sold again into a position of slavery. And Joseph wasn't walking 30 miles in the mud to the Sea of Galilee. Joseph was walking from Israel to another continent. And Joseph wasn't walking in his nice Merrill hiking boots, but rather Joseph was walking probably tied to the back of a camel or a donkey or a wagon or something like that. And all the while Joseph was walking down into Egypt, and while Joseph was being carted off as a slave, no doubt, just as Caleb and his friends were like, man, that's a real big complainer, but hey, props to that guy because he's really, he has a lot of character. He's not complaining about this bad trip. Now imagine what the Ishmaelites or the Midianites, imagine what they thought about Joseph when they watched how he reacted after that he had been sold into slavery by his own brothers. And I think we can see a little clue to their what they had done after they watched him, because it doesn't say that Joseph was taken to the auction block. It doesn't say that Joseph was taken to go with the other slaves to help build the pyramids, but rather it says that Joseph was sold to the highest of the high besides Pharaoh himself. Joseph was taken as a valuable person and said, hey, you know what? We're going to sell him to Potiphar himself. Why? Because Joseph has something in him that many of these other slaves don't have. Joseph has character. You see, because character is found in who we are acted out in the circumstances and in the situations of our life. And Joseph's reputation proved that he had what? He had integrity. He was through within and without. And oftentimes our integrity, our character is found in our reactions, and we're about to look at that a little more deeply. But tonight, for the next few minutes, we'll probably finish before 8. I wish Kenny was here. He would owe me $50 just like last time for finishing early. But let's look at three defining principles in Joseph's life, and we'll look at why did Joseph have a good name, and we'll apply those principles to our lives and say, hey, you know what? Maybe one of these principles I am exemplifying, and another one I am not. But the first of those is this, if you are taking notes, is that Joseph demonstrated causative leadership. Joseph demonstrated causative leadership. Essentially what that means is it means that Joseph was intentional in the way he acted. Joseph was intentional in the way that he lived his very life. And you see, one of the first things about Joseph's life when Joseph, or rather when the story of Joseph begins, is that we see that God gives Joseph dreams. And God begins to communicate to Joseph through these dreams. And he begins to tell him, hey, here's the future. You don't understand it now, but if you believe it, I will certainly make it come to pass. And we see that Joseph, what did he do? He dreamt of how his brothers and his parents would one day bow down to him, not in worship, but what the Bible would call, they would do obeisance to him. They would bow out of honor and out of respect. And this was kind of shocking for the brothers and for the parents to hear. Why? Because this was the youngest of the siblings. But Joseph knew that this is not merely a dream like you or I would have about just some random thing that happened to us during the day. Joseph knew that, hey, this is God communicating to me. Because we know that they didn't have the written word of God at that time, but he would communicate to them through dreams or through an angel of the Lord that he would send. And we find that Joseph knew that it was from God because by the time the butler called Joseph up to interpret Pharaoh's dream, after that he was in prison, Joseph said this. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not me, but God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace." So when it came time for Joseph not only to interpret his dream, but to interpret Pharaoh's, he said, hey, interpretations, they belong to God. So what do we know that Joseph knew? We know that Joseph had in his life, although it was just 2 verses in the Bible, we know that Joseph had what? The Word of God, as it was given unto him. And we see that by the time Joseph is going to the palace, he's the same person as when he was brought to prison. He's the same person from when he was brought to Potiphar and sent down into that pit by his brothers. And what we could see is the opposite of a causative leadership. Someone who shapes what they do not by the way that they feel, but rather by the truth that they know to be right. And essentially the opposite of that is someone who is reactionary. Someone who lives life shaped by their feelings. Someone who lives life shaped by their circumstances, shaped by the way that they feel. And why is that wrong to do? Well, essentially we know that we never feel the same way on a day-to-day basis. We know that feelings always fluctuate and circumstances are always given to change. And we know that oftentimes we want to take a circumstance and we want to say, hey, I don't know why this circumstance is happening, and we apply our emotion to it based on the way we feel. And moreover than that, we have this emotion and we say, why is this happening? Why do I feel this way? And we say, well, it's simply based upon the circumstances that are around us. And we know that that is no way to live, but rather that God has given us his completed word today. And that we're to live objectively, not subject to our feelings, not subject to the circumstances that are around us, but God has given us his word that we're not to live reactionary lives, but rather we're to live in a causative way, that we've said, hey, you know what, I'm not going to shape my life around what I feel. I'm not going to shape my life around what I think, but I'm going to intentionally live by the word of God. And by the time his brothers saw him, they didn't recognize his appearance. But eventually they did recognize the fact that, hey, this truly is our brother. And they recognized the character that was in his life. And you see, today, many of us, we think that in ministry and churches, it's oftentimes it's a personality that shows character. Or we think it's one thing, or it's the leader type and this and that. But the fact of the matter is that when we come to the end of our lives, it's not personalities that determine character. It's not the leader type that determines whether somebody has integrity or not, but rather it's the man who has stayed faithful to the truth of God's word, who has lived their life based upon what God has to say, and it is that man who is faithful to the day of his death and who retains his good name. So we know that Joseph, he demonstrated causative leadership. But more than that, we see that Joseph, he defected from his compromised legacy. If we're looking in chapter number 37, we find kind of an enigma in the book of Genesis. One of the strangest chapters in the Word of God is Genesis chapter number 38, which talks about Joseph's brother Judah. It completely shifts out of the entire story of Joseph, and it looks at how Judah was essentially the exact opposite of Joseph. Judah was a man who possessed no character at all. his morality was not there. He violated the conscience that was within him. And Judah, I'm not going to get into all of it, but he did a lot of atrocious things and a lot of horrible things. And it just showed that while Judah was such a horrible person, at the same time, Joseph could be such an upright man. And like Job, it could be said of Joseph, he feared God and he hated evil. And Joseph was a man whose not only siblings were full of lust and full of deception, but we can go back to Genesis 20. And we find that Abraham, the one who God had chosen to bless and the one that God had chosen to work through, Abraham does what? When a famine comes to town, Abraham goes down to Egypt. Then Abraham goes and he sees Pharaoh, and he ends up lying about his wife. He says, hey, this is my sister. And he deceives others who are around him. And what happens? He eventually gets his wife back because God intervened in that situation, because God was going to fulfill his promise to provide a son through Abraham and Sarah. But what happens? He gets her back, but he essentially hurts his reputation. And then come time for Isaac to do the same thing, he does the same thing. When Isaac, he lies about his wife during a famine in Genesis chapter number 36, and likewise of his father, he gets her back, but he again hurts his reputation. And what we can learn just from these two instances is that children will often bear the vices of their parents. That children will often see the negatives in their parents, and they will adapt and they will adopt rather that same philosophy. And then come time for Genesis 27, what do we find? Jacob and his mom, they scheme together. They lie to Isaac and they steal Esau's birthright. Jacob, who, by the way, never sees his mother again. The mother who favored him so much. And then after that, Jacob has a hard life, and he goes and he works for Laban, who, by the way, he was deceived by into marrying both daughters. Then he gets 2 other wives, and then he has all of these children, and at the end of his life, we find him doing what? We find him living up to the name that he was named. He was named Supplanter, which essentially means deceiver. So from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, we find what? We find a compromised legacy. We find men who have set the worst example for Joseph that they could possibly have, or that he could possibly have. And so Joseph, while he's looking around, he's looking at his father and at his grandfather and at his great-grandfather, these people who God had chosen to use and to work through and to build a nation through. And he's looking around at his siblings who were liars. They lied about where they were taking their sheep to feed, and they lied about the relationships they had, which were completely against what God had instructed them to do. And what do we see? Jacob was surrounded by vices, by lies, by lusts. But you know what Joseph did? Joseph said, you know what? I'm not going to live like all the people around me. And you see, tonight we know that while our circumstances often do hurt where we're going in our life, they don't define who we are in our life. And while Joseph realized that while he had a compromised legacy, he realized that through the personal decisions and the personal character and the integrity that he had, that this compromised legacy that surrounded him and that defined the name that he held as far as his family went, it didn't have to be a continuing legacy in his life. This compromised legacy of people who surrounded him and all the things that were negative and the vices that were taught to him, those things did not have to be exemplified in the life that he lived. You see, when Joseph was in Potiphar's house, and when Potiphar's wife came to him day by day by day, he realized that he, like Judah, could have simply lied about the women that he had gone in unto. But Joseph said, you know what, I'm going to keep my integrity. And Joseph, while he could have lied about the acts that he had with Potiphar's wife, he said, you know what, I don't want any part of that. And Joseph said, I'm going to put aside this compromised legacy that I have, and I'm going to retain the character that God has built into my life. We know from the Word of God in Ezekiel 18, it says that the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father. Neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son, but the Bible says, but the righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon them. Essentially, what that verse is saying is it's saying that while we often do learn the vices, and we often do learn the bad habits of the parents and the siblings and all of the people who are around us, the many influences in our lives, every man is responsible for his own decision. Every man is responsible for the path that he creates for himself. We're all responsible for the consequences of our own actions. And Joseph rather, he realizes that, hey, you know what? I'm not going to be responsible for my children having vices, but likewise, I'm going to be responsible for the actions that I have. And you know what? If I want to have character in my life, if I want to live unto the things that God has told me, I'm going to shape my life based around the Word of God. And I'm going to live my life according to the things that God has told me. And Joseph, all the while, he was looking for that promise. He was waiting on the time where God will fulfill his promise and where he would see his siblings and his parents do the obeisance unto him. So we know that Joseph, he defected from a compromised legacy, and he demonstrated causative leadership. But last of all, we see that Joseph lived a consecrated life. Brother Jacob, you can come on this last point. What essentially that means is Joseph lived a devoted life. Joseph was a man who was genuine. When Joseph did something, we knew that Joseph wasn't essentially putting on, but through and through, he was the same person all the way through his life. You see, oftentimes you hear it in business or in whatever, you hear fake it till you make it. But the simple fact of the matter is that fake it till you make it, it doesn't work in Christianity. Because Christianity is never about what we do before it is about who we are. We're not to be human doings, but rather we're to be human beings. And we know that Joseph was a man who when he said something, essentially he did it. And while Joseph, he had a weird end to his life where he was trying to teach his brothers a lesson by the things he did with the seed and the grain and all of these things. He wasn't being hypocritical as much as he was trying to reveal it in the right time. But essentially, we know that every experience in our life, in some facet, is a learning experience. And with every learning experience, there is a time where God is using that to build character in our life. And Joseph was a man who, chiefly, the reason he had so much character is because he had so much humility. And Joseph's life has so many parallels, not only to Jesus, but also to Job. And we know that in Job's life, the trials that he went through, that God had a very specific purpose for those trials. And God did the same work in Joseph's life that he did in Job's life. You see, through the trials that Joseph and that Job went through, God not only proved and revealed the character that they had, but he also revealed the character that they lacked. And it is through the trials, it is through the hard times in life that we go through that God reveals the character that we have. And he says, you know what, during this hard time, I'm going to prove that. I'm going to prove the character that you have and show you that, hey, this is real and this is pleasing to me. But moreover than that, through our trials, God reveals the character that he still needs to build into our life. He reveals the things that need to change. He reveals the adjustments that we need to make so that essentially when the day of our death comes, that we can have a good name. But let me remind you all tonight that while we may have had a hurt reputation in 2017 or even in this new year, like the vice president of our college used to say, today can be the first day of the rest of your Christian life. Which that's not a corny phrase, but essentially it's saying, hey, the bad consequences of the bad decisions that you made yesterday, you can begin making the right decisions for the right consequences for tomorrow. And with heads bowed and eyes closed, if we'll just stand to our feet if you're able. The only question that I have for you tonight is there been some experience, some way that God's been working in your life to not only reveal your character, not only to prove your character, but moreover to build in the character that you lack? You see, Joseph was a man who had character. He was a man who lived with integrity. And when it came time for that integrity to be tested, he didn't put it aside. He didn't compromise his legacy by living like his family, and he demonstrated causative leadership. He was intentional about living after the truth. And if God's spoken to your heart tonight, we're just going to open the altar for one verse as Jacob sings.